Rick Perlstein is the author of Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater, and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Award for History in 2001. And Nixonland, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America, a New York Times bestseller picked by more than 12 publications as a top 10 nonfiction book in 2008. He currently blogs 3 times a week, as many of you know, at thenation.com. He's a former online columnist and frequent contributor to The New Republic and Rolling Stone, former national correspondent for The Village Voice. His journalism and essays have appeared in Newsweek, The Nation, The New York Times, and many other publications. Perlstein has been called the chronicler extraordinaire of American conservatism by Politico, and the hyper-caffeinated Herodotus of the American century by The Nation. He lives and hyper-caffeinates in Hyde Park, where he's at work on a book on the 1970s and the rise of Ronald Reagan. He plays jazz piano on the side. And jazz piano makes sense. I remember reading that when Art Tatum's recordings first came out, people thought there were 2 people playing piano at the same time. And I get some of that sense from the engaging way that Rick writes about history. Getting all the notes right, but swinging as he does. So I look forward to hearing him improvise today. Please join me in welcoming Rick Perlstein.
Thank you, Ken, for such a gracious introduction. I do hope to improvise a little bit. I realize when I kind of put together a speech like this, I've been writing about the right wing for so long, and I had this massive store of lore and ideas, and it only occurred to me as I was driving here that one of my favorite stories about the history of the right wing is about ethical humanism. So I immediately pulled out my computer when I got here and started looking through my notes, which are this vast database of insanity and wingnuttery, and just kind of slotted something in. So thank you for having me. Thank you, Matt Cole, for inviting me. And I look forward to not only speaking, but engaging with you. So, in addition to learning about history as a succession of presidents, many of you might have learned that history is often defined as the study of continuity and change. When I think about this phenomenon that we've come to call the Tea Parties, my interpretation is perhaps unique in that I emphasize the continuities in American history much more than the idea that this is some new phenomenon. The continuity is going back at least to the World War II era, if not before, to the New Deal era. And that's important to point out because the Tea Party in the media has been widely misunderstood, misdescribed as a new expression of a grassroots, a nonpartisan passion to cut the size of government. In the wake of the government bailouts of homeowners and banks after the subprime mortgage crisis, whose 5th anniversary we're celebrating with the implosion of the Lehman House Bank in 2008. Now, where does this misunderstanding come from? Well, first of all, it's smart politics on the part of the Tea Party's leaders. And when I say Tea Party's leaders, there are really 2 groups of leaders. There's just kind of the grassroots citizen leaders, and there's the kind of top-down kind of professional conservatives in Washington who are always kind of scanning the horizon for right-wing discontent to organize for their own purposes. Partisanship is not a very popular idea in American politics. So saying that the Tea Party are nonpartisan makes them sound a lot more high-minded, makes them sound a lot more neutral, makes them sound a lot more noble. Now, the misunderstanding also comes from the people whose job it is professionally to describe reality to us, the political pundits. And the political pundits these days, among them, it's very fashionable to argue that the biggest problem America faces is its debt and its deficit and the size of government. Now, some of you might be fans of the New York Times columnist and economist at Princeton University, Paul Krugman. And if you read Paul Krugman, you know, because he hammers it home day after day and week after week, that the debt and the deficit is not a serious problem, at least in the short term. But among other pundits, the Thomas Friedmans of the world, the editorialists at the Washington Post, the kind of people you see contending with Paul Krugman on TV, the idea that the deficit is the most important problem is very fashionable. So when they saw this group come from the grassroots, supposedly, saying we need to cut the size of government, they saw kind of fellow travelers in their own personal and narcissistic crusade. Now, I'm not a big fan of these pundits. I'm kind of something of a pundit myself, but I cut across the grain. And a big part of my work as a historian is kind of making fun of these guys. I love, I got a little applause in the back for that. That's great. I got a fellow traveler in the back row. Hopefully I'll yoke a few along with me along the way. I love writing in my history books, the first of which about Barry Goldwater goes from 1958 to 1964, and the second one about Richard Nixon goes from 65 to 72. I love to make fun of their terrible predictions. So at the end of my book on Barry Goldwater, just to briefly kind of give an outline, Barry Goldwater was the guy who came out of nowhere and won the Republican nomination, even though he was far, far to the right of any previous Republican nominee. The conservative movement had taken over the Republican Party from the grassroots. They had said that if we finally have a conservative nominee and the people are given a choice of a true conservative who attacks the New Deal head on, then finally we'll see that America is fundamentally conservative and liberalism will be vanquished. And then came Election Day, and Lyndon Johnson wins the biggest landslide in the history of the country. 44 states, Goldwater only winning 5 states in the South in his own state of Arizona. And what did the pundits say the day after the election? Scotty Reston, who was kind of the Tom Friedman of his day at the New York Times, said, Barry Goldwater has not only lost the presidential election yesterday, but the conservative cause as well. He has wrecked his party for a long time to come and is not even likely to control the wreckage. The liberal columnist Tom Wicker said, Republicans cannot win in this era of American history except as a Me Too party. In other words, imitating the Democrats and adopting the New Deal and the Great Society as their own. Walter Lippmann, who was kind of the most distinguished, gray-beard kind of commentator on American politics, said, the Johnson majority is indisputable proof that the voters in America are in the liberal center. And the Los Angeles Times said, a conservative party advocating reactionary changes at home and adventures abroad that might lead to war will remain a minority party indefinitely. Well, all these people received their humiliation in spades, not only when Ronald Reagan was elected president 12 years later, 16 years later, but 2 years later in 1966, when all the congressmen who were elected as liberals on Lyndon Johnson's coattails were all kicked out of office. Here in Chicago, some of you who were around then might remember that the liberal Senator Paul Douglas got beaten by a Republican because he had supported Martin Luther King when Martin Luther King came to Chicago. And there was a huge backlash against the civil rights movement in Chicago, and suddenly one of the most distinguished liberal senators was kicked out. And way out in California, this crazy actor became governor, this guy named Ronald Reagan. In 1976, the New Yorker's political writer, after Ronald Reagan lost the Republican nomination at the convention by a hair whisker, said, this is the end of Ronald Reagan's political career. I reviewed a book by a pundit named Nina Easton that came out in the year 2000. It was a book about the Newt Gingrich revolutionaries, the people who would sign the contract with America and took the House of Representatives for the Republicans for the first time in a generation. She said that by pursuing politics as war, the Gingrich revolutionaries are doomed to always fall short of their goals. These pundits are always declaring that the right wing is this phenomenon that's going to, die out because it's out of step with the American mainstream, the American consensus. The most crucial idea that the pundits have is that America is this nation of consensus, that we're united and at peace with itself. Of course, this has never really been the case. If you think about the Constitutional Convention, its fundamental founding act of the American nation was a compromise that papered over the deep fissure between the forces of the South, whose economy was built on slavery, and the forces of the North, whose economy was built on a new industrialism and of yeoman farmers. And that fundamental fissure, which is over the issue of slavery, which is over the issue of race, was always kind of papered over and denied and denied and denied until it erupted into a maelstrom in the 1860s in the form of a war in which 600,000 Americans slaughtered each other. Right. And then after the Civil War, this idea that America was this nation fundamentally at peace with itself, that we are a nation of consensus, expressed itself in these rituals of reconciliation. They'd have Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers marching together in 4th of July parades. This idea that the Civil War was a war between brothers that didn't have to be fought, that really was this kind of unnatural, exception in American life. But within 15 years after the Civil War, we're seeing the biggest strike wave in American history. We're seeing Pinkerton slaughtering strikers. We're seeing the rise of Jim Crow in the South. And this happens again and again and again. Right before Kennedy's assassination, the pundits are saying America is more united and at peace with itself than it ever has before. And then we see Kennedy assassinated, and people are acting like political violence within the context of American history has never been seen before. We're seeing what we associate with the 1960s. We're seeing mass violence in the streets over the issue of the Vietnam War. We see this again and again and again. The pundits deeply wish to believe that Americans are on the same page, but the American people are never cooperating. Can you give me some water, maybe? Sure. Thanks. So, to return to the Tea Party. The fact of the matter is, the Tea Party are not what these pundits think they are. They're not this kind of benign, nonpartisan movement devoted to cutting spending and reining in the growth of government. First of all, the best reporting on the Tea Parties was full of examples of its leaders within Congress begging for federal money for their districts. Its members personally benefiting from federal money in their own businesses, of elderly Tea Party denizens wheeling their way into rallies in motorized scooters paid for by Medicare, and then holding up signs saying, "Keep the government out of my Medicare." The fact of the matter is it's more accurate to identify the Tea Party as continuous with a long strain of right-wing movements in American life that share a moral vision of the world, a chain of equivalences that sees the world, sees American life as a clash between good guys and bad guys, of deserving and undeserving poor, of a danger of continual civilizational collapse, of slippery slopes that will lead to the decline of all that is good and true, and a terror of a vision of liberty that includes the right to live an unconventional life, a secular life, and of visions of equality which see American political life as an exchange of mutual obligation. I'm just going to grab a glass of water. Rule of thumb, when you give a speech, always remember to hydrate. Thank you. Thank you, Ken. I'm going to quote some actual evidence, some data from the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam. He wrote an op-ed about this 3 years ago in the New York Times. Beginning in 2006, we interviewed a sample of 3,000 Americans as part of our continuing research into national political attitudes, and we returned to interview many of the same people again this summer. We can look at what people told us long before there was a Tea Party to predict who would become a Tea Party supporter 5 years later, long before the Tea Party was born. We also account for multiple influences simultaneously, isolating the impact of one factor while holding others constant. Statistically, what they call a regression analysis. Our analysis casts doubt on the Tea Party's origin story. Early on, Tea Parties were often described as nonpartisan political neophytes. Actually, the Tea Party's supporters today were highly partisan Republicans long before the Tea Party was born, and were more likely than others to have contacted government officials. In fact, past Republican affiliation is the single strongest predictor of Tea Party support today. While the public image of Tea Party focuses on the desire to shrink government, concern over big government is hardly the only or even the most important predictor of Tea Party support among voters. More importantly, they were disproportionately social conservative in 2006, opposing abortion, opposing abortion, opposing abortion, for example, and still are today. Next to being a Republican, the strongest predictor of being a Tea Party supporter today was desire in 2006 to see religion play a more dominant role in politics. And Tea Partiers continue to hold these views. They seek, quote, deeply religious elected officials, approve of religious leaders engaging in politics, and want religion brought into political debates. The Tea Party's generals may say their overriding concern is a smaller government, but not their rank and file, who are more concerned with putting God in government. So what do Tea Partiers have in common? They are overwhelmingly white, but even compared to other white Republicans, they have a low regard for immigrants and blacks long before Barack Obama was president, and still do. By the way, there's an old joke that politicians tell. What do you call a black man at a Republican dinner? Keynote speaker. The idea of throwing black folks in the front of the party is an old political trick. I won't go into the details, but his results were confirmed by new work by an Emory political scientist named Alan Abramowitz. So what are the continuities in the Tea Party to right-wing movements in the past? This idea of good guys and bad guys. And never the twain shall meet. The idea that kind of the good guys are good in their heart and the bad guys are unmitigated evil. And they will embrace things when the good guys do it and reject them when the bad guys do it, and flip their allegiances when the good guys and bad guys change places. We can give the example of the Republicans who criticized CIA and NSA excesses when Barack Obama was president, but looked the other way when George Bush was president. But why don't we go back to the 1940s? When J. Edgar Hoover leaked to Walter Trojan of the Chicago Tribune that the organizers of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services proposed to make their agency permanent in what would become the Central Intelligence Agency, the Chicago Tribune editorialized that FDR was creating, quote, an American Gestapo. A Republican congressman called the nascent CIA another indication that the New Deal will not halt in its quest for power. Like Simon Legree, it wants to own us body and soul. Another conservative called the CIA another New Deal move right along the Hitler line. In other words, this idea that Barack Obama is a modern-day Hitler is not a new trope. It would centralize power in Washington. Basically, the CIA, the people who were the kind of principals in the CIA, and before that, the Office of Strategic Services, were the sort of kind of Eastern establishment types that conservatives have always mistrusted. And the clincher is that people like this were utterly silent about the actual American Gestapo in their midst, which was the J. Edgar Hoover FBI. because J. Edgar Hoover was a good guy. He was a conservative hero. Another thing that conservative populist movements share in common is the idea of the slippery slope. That basically any tiny step that falls afoul of the way they see the world will soon lead to tyranny. We see that most profoundly these days in the gun control debate. The idea that if we institute background checks to make sure that people who are psychotic or blind or criminal don't get guns, that soon there's going to be, quote unquote, an American Gestapo taking all our handguns that we use to shoot deer. But we don't, again, have to go to the gun control debate. We can go way back on this one. Let me quote some conservatives about a bill that was pending before Congress. These are quotes from congressmen on the floor of the House of Representatives. Never in the history of the world has any measure been so insidiously designed to prevent business recovery, to enslave workers, to prevent any possibility of employers providing work for the people. Quote, invites the entrance into the political field of a power so vast, so powerful, as to pull the pillars of the temple down upon the head of our descendants. Sooner or later will bring about the abandonment of private capitalism. Are they talking about Obamacare? Social Security. My brother gets it right. I think civilization is still around. You know, I joke that just like conservatives campaign to say that they're going to save Social Security, in a generation they're going to be campaigning to say they're saving Obamacare. We saw the same thing with Martin Luther King. I found an astonishing quote that I used on Stephen Kornacki's show on MSNBC a couple of weeks ago that really got a lot of attention. Ronald Reagan was the guy who signed the legislation establishing the Martin Luther King national holiday. He linked arms with Tip O'Neill and signed saying "We Shall Overcome." In 1968, he said that basically when King was assassinated that this is just what you get when people start choosing which laws they're going to break. In other words, Martin Luther King had it coming for instituting the notion of civil disobedience. So civilization never collapses, and then they just kind of move on to the next panic that's going to lead to the downfall of civilization. Fake scandals. Then it was the idea that the IRS is infiltrating right-wing organizations. But to take one from 1961, when John F. Kennedy beginning talks with the kind of dissident communist nation of Yugoslavia to maybe bring them into the American orbit, conservatives decided that he was in league with the communists, and thousands of delegates from 90 cities packed something called the National Indignation Convention in 1961, a Dallas 1961 version of today's Tea Parties. A keynote speaker turned to the master of ceremonies after the introduction and remarked, as the audience roared, "Tom Anderson here has turned moderate. All he wants to do is impeach Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren. I am for hanging him." The idea of infiltration, the idea that bad guys are kind of worming their way within the government. Now we see a lot of talk about the Muslim Brotherhood infiltrating Obama's White House. Of course, then it was communists. The John Birch Society said that Dwight David Eisenhower was a, quote, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. And Clinton, do you remember when people were talking about Clinton's youthful visit to Moscow and how important that was in understanding his plan to disarm the United States? My personal favorite is the idea that the federal government, when there was a bill to expand mental health services in Alaska, the new state, during the Kennedy era, and one of the most widely listened to right-wing radio programs of the time, hosted by a former FBI agent, had millions of Americans believing that it was actually going to build prison camps for conservatives in the same way that the Soviet Union had used mental health facilities to impound dissidents. Now, of course, Glenn Beck said the same thing about FEMA, that they were building camps to impound conservatives. Now, the funny thing is I literally have forgotten more about this crazy stuff than most people know. And like I said, I was driving here, and I was like, oh, wait, I forgot about the whole secular humanism scare of the 1970s. So I'm going to just read something I wrote in the Rolling Stone last year. One of the most robust and effective conspiracies on the right has been the canard that secular humanism is a literal religion. I'm here to say that this is the least religious service I've ever seen. How did they know secular humanism was a religion? Because they said the Supreme Court said so. Does anyone know this story? Anyone heard of the Supreme Court case? Well, I'll tell you about it. Tarasco versus Watkins. Religious historian Martin E. Marty, who lives here in Chicago, wrote, "It was an instance where one can precisely date the birth of a religion, June 19th, 1961. That was the day the court ruled in the case of Torquazo versus Watkins, striking down the Maryland Constitution's requirement of, quote, a declaration of belief in the existence of God to hold any office or profit or trust in the state." It was a case about an atheist named Roy Torquazo who held the office of notary public and refused to pledge allegiance to God. In his decision, Justice Black asserted that states and the federal government could not favor religions, quote, based on a belief in the existence of God as against those religions found on different beliefs. And in a fateful and entirely offhand footnote, explained, quote, among religions in this country which do not teach that what would generally be considered a belief in the existence of God are Buddhism, Taoism, ethical culture, secular humanism, and others. Thereupon, things got wacky. As unearthed by the scholar Carol Mason in 1974, a Jesuit priest and Fordham University law professor named Edward Berbas argued that, quote, since humanism is now considered by the court to be a religion, it must be prevented from being established by the government. An activist asked him if that meant they could win their fight to ban secular textbooks being forced upon the students of Kanawha County, West Virginia. You like that one? By taking the school board to the Supreme Court. I think you may have the material if you can get a Cracker Jack lawyer, Father Berbas responded. Now, the Supreme Court case never happened, although they did dynamite the school board building in Kanawha County, West Virginia. A wonderful story you can read about in my book that's going to come out next year. Not least because, as the Supreme Court case didn't happen because, and I'm quoting a scholar of the right named Chip Burrell, while historically there has been an organized humanist movement in the United States, at least since the 1800s, the idea of a large-scale quasi-religion called secular humanism is a conspiracist myth. In fact, on the right, secular humanism became not just an imaginary religion, it was, as the subtitle of a 1984 book put it, the most dangerous religion in America. Their faith was that man, not God, determines human affairs. And also, as Martin Marty paraphrased the argument, when a textbook does not mention the God of the Bible, it necessarily leads to a void which it must fill with the religion of secular humanism. So the argument is if a textbook isn't religious, it must be religious. So it requires religion to balance secular humanism in capital letters. That means that any textbook that does not mention the guiding hand of God is perforce part of a conspiracy. Prima facie evidence that secular humanists had written it. The absence was the presence. Liberals, dumbfounded by the irrationality in that patented liberal way, we're always so rational, pointed out that the number of people calling themselves secular humanists was only a handful, as I'm sure your treasurer will attest. Well, the fundamentalist would counter, doesn't that just prove the success of the conspiracy? in America Grand, the professional right in Washington had found their substitute for the communist conspiracy during the era of détente. In many ways, secular humanism was the Red Menace's superior as an organizing tool because it so neatly took the fight directly to the bloodiest crossroads in our political culture, the space between the school and the home. There was no more effective way to organize against liberalism than to argue that liberals were invading the sacred precinct of the nuclear family, which Christian Reconstructionist theologian Rousas J. Rushdoony argued in his 1972 book, The Messianic Character of American Education, was the basic unit under God's government. The basic unit of government under God's covenant, the family. The power-grabbing would-be Messiah, in other words, the government, could only be defeated, argued a Heritage Foundation staffer named Connie Marshner, by reversing the coming of the secular humanist state. The Leviathan of secular humanism left its grubby fingerprints everywhere. As a magazine called Christian Harvest explained, to understand humanism is to understand women's liberation, the ERA, gay rights, children's rights, abortion, sex education, the new morality, evolution, values clarification, situational ethics, the separation of church and state, the loss of patriotism, and many of the other problems that are tearing America apart today. In 1976, the Heritage Foundation published Secular Humanism in the Schools, the issue whose time has come for its audience of Washington policy elites, taking on practices like group therapy and sensitivity training, supposedly secular humanist Trojan horses, for showing hostility to theistic religion, values, and belief. This is incredibly seductive stuff for any ordinary citizen who wants to who finds the world they're forced to navigate frightening and alien. As Connie Marshner argued in her 1978 Manifesto for Parents' Rights, Blackboard Tyranny, mothers have long observed that after a child first starts school, the rest of the family starts catching more colds and flus. But other forms of diseases are not so evident. What about the personality traits that start developing? What about the dissatisfaction with family rules and routines? Why do children suddenly begin to complain about responsibilities towards brothers or sisters? Why do they resent doing unaccustomed chores? Why does off-color language or unfamiliar slang suddenly crop up in a child's conversations? In her thinking, the liberal state is an infection responsible for all the family's manifold ills. A comforting story, especially when there are politicians in Washington ready to swoop in to the rescue, say by giving people health care. Those politicians, of course, may or not really care about off-color slang infecting their constituents' living rooms, but it's really a handy way for the 1% to enlist them in crushing the liberal state that, say, peskily insists on regulating credit default swaps, or mortgage deductions, or all manner of business practices. That same year, 1976, a congressman from Arizona named John Conlon, now obscure, but once the evangelicals' first choice for president, introduced an anti-secular humanism bill. It passed the House of Representatives, and Concerned Women for America began donating legal services for parents wishing to challenge the teaching of secular humanism, predicting that 300,000 school districts might come under challenge by the year 1986. Megachurch minister Tim LaHaye, later author of the Left Behind series, said secular humanists were not qualified to hold government positions, neatly inverting the very Supreme Court decision, Torquezo versus Watkins, grounding their constitutional crusade in the first place. And in 1985, Congress passed the Education for Economic Security Act to improve science education, including funding for magnet schools, to which conservatives added an amendment prohibiting its use for, quote, teaching secular humanism. Conveniently not defining secular humanism and not even discussing what definition might be during the debate, except to note that local school boards could define it themselves. So fast forward to 2010, when we begin to see tea parties, organizing, citizens yelling at their representatives for death panels hidden within the Obamacare legislation. And then November of 2010, when once more the supposed liberal tide of Barack Obama was reversed by the Tea Party ascendancy in Congress. Okay, so I've spoken to these continuities, and hopefully I've driven some of them home. What are the changes? What's different in 2013 that wasn't the case in 1953 or 1963 or 1973 or 1983? For one thing, there's been a profound change within the institutions of the Republican Party, which used to have a very strong mix of ideologies. You'll remember people like Jake Javits, here in Illinois, Charlie Percy, moderate Republicans, even liberal Republicans. As the Republican Party became more and more the readout of conservative orthodoxy, that disciplining force was gone. And a 20 or 30% faction within the political culture as a whole took control of the Republican Party. Why were they able to get such profound control? One of the reasons is quite fascinating and unattended and kind of technical. It has to do with how the gerrymandering of congressional districts happens. So every 10 years, every state redraws its congressional district based on census data. But in most states, with a very noble exception of California, which has decided to make this a nonpartisan process in which every state should do, frankly, because politicians should not be able to choose their voters. Voters should be able to choose their politicians. Basically, the state legislature redraws the districts, and there are more state legislatures controlled by Republicans than Democrats, and this is often a very wicked process. And in Texas, I think about 10 years ago, advocacy group uncovered in a legal finding an email from a Republican activist in Texas who said, with this redistricting, we're going to be able to keep America Republican no matter how the voters choose. Basically, the way this works is if you draw a district that makes sure that basically it's always going to be 51% Republican by sticking all the Republicans in one district and sticking all the African Americans, liberals in another district, and making sure that a liberal district, a liberal wins by 90%, and a Republican district, a conservative wins by 51 or 55%, you can create a situation such that exists in Pennsylvania, where Barack Obama won the state by 55 to 45, but they have 9 Republican congressmen and 13 9 Republican congressmen and only 4 Democratic congressmen. And what this means is when a Republican congressman is guaranteed a seat, no matter basically what their positions are, the action politically, ideologically, turns to the primary, where a right-wing, say, Tea Party denizen can try and win the primary by becoming more and more extremist, and the incoming congressman has to adopt more and more conservatives in order to fight off the Tea Party challenge. So we have a real imbalance that pushes the Republican Party further and further and to the right. We've seen the decline of kind of the grown-ups within the conservative movement. It was very fascinating that an unseen kind of moving factor in the rise of the Tea Party within the Republican Party was it basically rose right after William F. Buckley passed away. He was just one guy, but he was a very powerful guy. It's very telling that the one person that Rush Limbaugh on the radio spoke of with reverence and respect was the person he called Mr. Buckley. I wouldn't be surprised to learn if William F. Buckley would occasionally place a call to Mr. Limbaugh and say, look, you got to lay off this, you got to respect the office of the presidency more, you can't rile up your supporters that much, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As soon as William F. Buckley was gone, we saw the flywheel that seemed to ground a lot of these right-wing radio lunatics move away. And finally, I talked about professional conservatives in Washington. Has anyone ever heard the name Richard Vickery? Yeah, he was one of the founders of the New Right in the 70s. And he was basically a businessman. His business was organizing and selling mailing lists to ideological groups. And the way he built these mailing lists was, as he put it to a reporter once, I organized discontent. He would find grassroots right-wing outrages in places like West Virginia where people were angry about the textbooks, in places like Miami where people were angry about a civic ordinance that provided gay rights for government employees. And he would basically use these local outrages to write panic-stricken direct mail letters that wrote about the slippery slope of liberals destroying Western civilization. He would build up his mailing lists. And basically for the Richard Vickery's multiplied. It became big business. If you're interested in learning more about this, you can look up an article of mine in the magazine The Baffler called The Long Con, in which I write about how this business became more and more lucrative, such that the people whose business model was making people as scared as possible became more and more sophisticated, such that when something like the bailouts happen, people like Tom DeLay, the right-wing congressman, Dick Armey, the right-wing congressman who ran the Washington-based professional conservative group Freedom Works, was able to kind of leverage this kind of panic to increase their mailing lists, raise money, organize, get in the media, and kind of scaffold their own agenda, which overlaps with that of grassroots DPRers but isn't identical. For example, the New York Times did a great expose of a supposed Washington-based Tea Party group that used their mailing list to basically sell a loophole in a law that advantaged a company that was doing business in Indonesia for their own purposes. Now, finally, how many of you guys saw in the New York Times this week the article about the recently discovered $236 million that the Koch brothers had poured into the 2012 election cycle that no one had even noticed before? Did anyone read that? This is the New York Times from Thursday. A single nonprofit group with ties to Charles G. and David H. Koch provided grants of $236 million to conservative organizations before the 2012 election, according to tax returns the group is expected to file Monday. Freedom Partners raises money from donors and then distributes it to other groups. The arrangement gives the donors an extra layer of anonymity and blurs the original source of money that fuels controversial campaigns. Other donor clearinghouses, along with nearly all of the political groups they support, register with the IRS as social welfare groups under Section 501c4 of the tax code. That has let such groups spend money on elections while keeping their donors secret, drawing increasing regulatory and legislative scrutiny from critics who assert that some of the groups are violating campaign laws. But Freedom Partners established itself in November of 2011 as a 501c6 business league, typically a trade association of corporations like the Chamber of Commerce organized to promote a common business interest. Instead of donors, it has 200, quote, members, each making a minimum $100,000 contribution. That's not a grassroots movement, folks. Which Freedom Partners classifies as member dues. The approach gives it many of the same advantages social welfare groups, with one significant addition. Some contributors to the group, contributions to the group may be tax deductible as a business expense. Very sophisticated lawyering, lots of aggressive ways to pour money into the political process, and tied together with a kind of organizing model in which local discontents are leveraged by Washington-based professional conservative groups to do things like game the legislative process so that the famous oil brothers, the Koch brothers, increased their profits by 50% during the Obama administration, at the same time as they were leveraging panic about Barack Obama to claim that he was destroying businesses' opportunity to make profit by doing things like passing laws like Obamacare and reform of Wall Street and all the rest. Okay, so that's a pretty depressing story for a depressing, gray, rainy day, but I can't end on that note. The best solvent, traditionally, within American politics for conservative cultural populism has always been liberal economic populism. All right. The way that you defeat Tea Parties is with policies within the Democratic Party that take on vested corporate interests, take on vested interests that defeat the opportunities to get into and stay in the middle class. That's how Franklin Roosevelt won 60% of the vote in 1936. That's how Lyndon Johnson won 60% of the vote in 1964. It means that every time a Democrat makes a compromise with the forces of vested money, that they very tragically make it harder to tell a story about the Democratic Party that resonates with the same sort of people who might be seduced by a Tea Party message. Politics, in a lot of ways, is about fear and resentment. But your fear can be of secular humanists teaching your children to use swear words, or it can be your fear of your boss destroying your dignity and economic security. It can be fear of losing your health insurance. It can be fear of your children being drowned in college debt. So all you folks, as fair-minded, thoughtful critics of right-wing moral panic, have a job to apply yourself within the political institutions that you're a part of to revive this notion that the government can become a reliable partner in building and sustaining a secure middle class. You do that through all the ways that activists have always done it. Through letters to politicians, through letters to editors, through knocking on doors, through participating in campaigns, by becoming informed on the issues. And ultimately, a political party is still made up of the people who vote for it. It's still made up by the people who contribute money for it. So that makes all of us, you and me and our friends and our neighbors and our family members, people who have our work cut out for us. If you want the American project to thrive, get to it. So I thank you for your attention.